If you don't know me, I'm David Sequeira, and I'm the person who has the privilege of putting the Art Forum program together. And I'm also the director of the Fiona and Sydney Meyer Gallery. And it really is a bit of a treat to welcome you back to Semester 2, 2024. And before I introduce our guest speaker, I invite you to join me in grounding yourself in the deep knowledge that for many generations, like for thousands of years, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation practiced song and dance, shared stories, made paintings, made sculptures on this country. And those traditions and rituals continue to today. And really, it's with great joy and honour that we acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. So look, a big welcome to everybody here. If you're one of the students who is going to graduate at the end of 2024, kaboom, this is the fast semester, so buckle up. And it's great to see you and great to be in Federation Hall. We've got a great program. We've always got a great program, but I'm excited because I don't know why I'm excited, but I am. I just love Art Forum. So anyway, enough about my excitement. Let's introduce our guest speaker, Cate Consandine. So Melbourne-based artist Cate Consandine works across a range of formal and discursive mediums, including sculpture and spatial practice, film and performance. She works with the body as a material for her practice and is particularly interested in the physical expression of emotional and psychological states, centering on the relationships between bodies and their contingent registers. Her work envisions affective embodied perspectives on moving image practices in dialogue with sculpture and situated screen architecture. Acts of cutting and the resulting fragment or part object are often utilised as an editing or performing strategy in the moving image and as a reductive strategy central to the sculptural process. Meditating upon the peripheral dimensions of the female gaze, Cate's work seeks to locate experience between stillness and movement, or the place where desire is posited, the edge of movement, and particularly fixes on the liminal body, a body on edge in the landscape. Cate's exhibited locally and internationally, including Gallery Samaja in Indonesia, the Museum of Contemporary Art Taiwan, POSCO Art Gallery South Korea, Institute of Contemporary Art London, the International Festival for Video Art Barcelona, the Art Gallery of New South Wales, Heide Museum of Modern Art, Gertrude Contemporary, and the Northern Centre for Contemporary Art in Darwin. And of course, Cate teaches here at the VCA in the Honours program, and her major 3-channel video, Ringer, is currently showing as part of the Same Crowd Never Gathers Twice at Buxton Contemporary, and a big shout out to Buxton and museums and collection staff who are here to be part of Cate's presentation. But wherever you are, whether you're in Zoom land or here in Federation Hall, please put your hands together and welcome Cate Consandine to the podium.
Thank you, David, for your welcome and also for your acknowledgement. I'd also like to welcome all First Nations and Indigenous people who are here with us today. My name's Cate. I've been here at the VCA for, I think it's over 10 years now, David. Feels like a long time, but it's been a great time, and it's really beautiful to be able to share my work here with all of the students and also my colleagues that I work with every day and I love, and who are continually sort of challenging me and opening me in different ways. So that's really special. So thanks for being here. I'm going to start by reading, and I'm hoping that as I sort of move through some of the works that I'll be able to lift off the page. I'm much better when I'm not reading, but we're going to start that way. I think that I want to start really talking from a position of sculpture, and I'm thinking about flesh, and I'm thinking about the embodiment of the eye and the eye. And I'm going to start with one sculptural work, and it's through that work I want to pivot through a range of different ideas that I think are foundational to my practice and the way that my practice opens out from sculpture to body to constructed environments, architecture, and moving image. So, do we have, are we on? June. Okay, back forward. Okay, great, we're on. So this sculpture is called Viriginus. It was made in 2022. It's photographed here in the Foundry. And it's a polished bronze sculpture. It's about 1.6 by 1.6 meters, and it's suspended by a single line. It has a mirror finish as well. So coming back to flesh and this idea of flesh, and I'm thinking about the surface which my eye desires, which my eye touches, or as Emmanuel Levinas would prefer, which my eye caresses. It's a profound sentiment when thinking of flesh. And Levinas talks about the way the eye brushes itself against the flesh of the other in an intimate horizon where two surfaces meet. This ambit becomes the demarcation zone of where I touch. And the proposition here is in the idea to contemplate the two distinct barriers that are not seen but felt, and the liminal pressure that each asserts upon the other that holds them in a kind of exquisite and delicate balance where they touch. I think about zones through all of my work, and I think this kind of thinking attests to the zone as a kind of active space. And that activity has a specific point of contact. For me, sculpting is to traverse from one threshold or state to another. And as a sculptor, I'm very sensitive to a pressing of my medium. And I think that the tip of my finger, I think of it as a kind of taut interface between the self and the material of the other body. And how in the midpoint between, there is always a curious collision for me between stillness and movement, stillness and anticipation. And it's a heightened state of desire that senses and poises the body kind of on a threshold of giving in. So in this work, there's a tipping point. It moves because it's suspended just on a single line, and it moves around and it tips. And I think it's a very taut and very tense figurative work, but there's a sense that it's always on the edge, and my bodies and my figures always sort of sit at the edge of a kind of threshold of giving in, I think, which places them in a state of anticipation. Just getting a little message from someone saying good luck. Yeah. So there's a dance here with the tipping point. It comes from a sort of understanding within my own body, really, of the way that we are balancing and rebalancing continuously. And it comes from an idea about the eye as an active, mobilized, saccadic, shifting body, shifting gaze. And this idea that our pupil opens and closes in response to conditions and altering conditions of light, that there's a saccadic jump between two eyes, that there is no real still point, but we are constantly in a state of balance and rebalancing. So I'm trying to capture sculpture in that state of moving between different thresholds, different edge conditions, but at the center of it, there's also something that's quite powerfully strong and forceful that I think sits within this work. So here the body is a kind of lever, both beholden and dancing with the promise of a release into flight or freedom. To take a turn around sculpture is to activate a moving image in the round. And that's the relationship I draw between sculpture and moving image practices. For every turn, there is a return, and a kind of circle that reaches back. And so if I take a turn here around this sculpture, Viriginus, I'm attempting in a way to chart a number of key methods that speak to the evolution of my process. And what passes through these operations is a contingent relationship between the body, sculpture, and the moving image. As the artist, I take the first turn, and that movement around sculpture to create the sculpture, that circuit, I see as the first choreography, the original choreography. And when we sculpt, because we sculpt in the round, and when a viewer enters the space with sculpture, what happens is a kind of reenactment of sorts, another turning around sculpture. The circuit and the circle and the movement and the kind of loop, they're things that sit and seem to sort of come back and take a return in all of my work, so that it'll keep coming back, I guess, into the conversation. I want to talk also about Viriginus as a mannered and expressive sculptural work, perhaps embarrassingly so. There's something about it that's not cool. There's a musculature and a force that is so assertive and so active in this work, and her sexuality asserts too. The title Viriginus speaks to a kind of heroic, warlike feminine, and yet she hangs off a single line in delicate balance, in a continuous state of rebalancing. It's a V for Viriginus. It's a V for peace. It's a V for vagina. It's a geometry, an open triangle. It's receptive and projective in the space that asserts between her legs and receives between her legs. And I think about perhaps the difference between this work being so expressive and so mannered, embarrassingly so, to, I guess, a point of reflecting back to perhaps Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci that dates back to 1490. And here in that work, if anyone knows that work, you probably all do, we see a male figure kind of composed in an essential symmetry, and within this sphere, by extension, the universe as a whole. So when I refer back to that work, that male figure, there's a symbolic whole, there's a sense of an idea of order, there's a sense of the way geometry works in relationship to the body, and it really does speak to this kind of, I guess, a symbolic whole. What I love about Viriginus as a mannered sculpture, a bit too much, is that it disrupts that order. It's dynamic and it's emotional, and it has an attenuated musculature. And I love that she asserts in this way. So I took this sculpture Viriginus and I also placed her in a moving image work, and I'm going to play that for you and just maybe talk about that relationship of bringing a sculptural work into a moving image work with another performer to kind of extend upon some of these ideas and relationships. And this is called Her Arrival. I love the glitch in the Matrix moment. I love her death stare. I love how erotic it is. I love the active zone between the legs. A friend of mine, Stephen Garrett, wrote something about this that I'm going to read out because I think it's a kind of beautiful observation of this work and perhaps also an observation of me as an artist. He writes, her arrival came as no surprise. Somewhere between the space of her body and her other body is a void, a rupture, but probably more a schism within space, time, sound, light. She is the mirror of all mirrors, reflecting herself onto the surface of every other surface. Her skin, my skin. We are both. She is the inversion of herself, her flesh made gleaming and her flesh made real. Placed into the world, though she fell onto the world. The word made flesh. Incarnate and real, stepping through the void and onto the earth. She steps over herself, into herself, onto herself. She is the mirage, the mirror, and the open scar of all before her and all after her. She is the first and the last. I think what I draw out of this and what I understand about the image of the female presence with another female body in the presence of her own body and meeting her own body is again that relationship of touch when one isn't touching, and a kind of understanding of this active zone that is so loaded and so intense. And it's a kind of active zone that I understand really deeply when I touch material and when I touch clay, and really all around me in my presence and feeling in the world. I think also what's drawn out of this is a kind of an eternalized image of the female figure and the female body and a female presence. She doesn't need anything but herself. She is in a state, almost a sexual state of fever with herself. And her legs and the sculptor, the legs in the sculpture almost become, for me, a kind of fetish, a phallus that she has and occupies her own fetish within herself, within the space of her sexual desire and potency. There's also something in this work that sits and moves across all of my moving image works. And it's a kind of space between stillness and anticipation, or stillness and movement. And it comes from a sculptural understanding, I think, of stillness that sits within sculpture and movement that orientates in relationship to sculpture. And when I think about editing, I'm always often holding space, holding the body, thinking about that tipping point, thinking about something that's close to still, but not quite still. And there's a kind of palpable tension that sits in that space for me. I'm going to leave that one there. And I want to maybe talk about a work that I made actually when I was at the VCA called Prowl, Stalker. This is actually re-exhibited at First Sight Gallery with my beautiful friend and colleague Sonia Pahoki in an exhibition called A Thin White Line. And it takes my work back to 1999, which is when I made this in the sculpture school. And it was presented originally in what was called then the Pons Institute, which was overseen by Janet Birchall. And it was kind of a counter condition to David Wilson's constructivist sculpture that occupied the workshop on the other side. And I painted that whole space black in the first iteration of this work and placed this structure, a kind of, I'd say it's kind of like a formal abstraction within the space. And Janet wasn't very happy about having to paint the black back to white. I think these images don't really reveal the quality of the work in the way that it feels when you're in a space with it. But it's based upon, I guess, drawn from a form that used to be quite present in Melbourne around the early 2000s. And this structure is a mediating structure called a prow. And it used to sit at the edge of the tram stop, and it used to be a buffer. and cars would then see this orange prow and sort of turn and reorientate so that they didn't hit people that were waiting for the tram at the stop. What I understood about that kind of structure is that it was chunky and kind of concrete, but there were always these big chunks out the side of it. I'm like, which car hit that bit? It made me have an understanding that it seemed to be a mediating structure to create a safety zone, but in fact, it wasn't safe. And I really wanted to take that form and extend and intensify this feeling of uncertainty that sat within it. So it became something pointed and sharp. It was constructed out of wood. Its surface was marked with UV paint, and it's hit with blue light. So the whole thing kind of hovered, and it was really difficult to understand where the surface was. So in a way, when I start to think about this work, what it offered back to me as a kind of abstraction was a sculptural work that had a surface that was vibrating with light, a little bit like a screen surface, in fact, that it offered itself as a strip, as a line, a parabolic curve. It suggested a body that could be propelled in an unparalleled direction, shot into space, slightly paranoid, a formal abstraction, an apparition, and a science fiction. I think it is a work that references Tarkovsky's film Stalker. And when I thought about the safety zone that operated in relationship to this work, I was thinking about the zone that sat in Stalker, which is a kind of science fiction space where strange things happen, and the character of Stalker has to navigate through that space of the zone to try to get to, I guess, to travel people through it, and it's a difficult navigation. I like the displacement and the uncertainty of what the kind of zone or the idea of a zone offered, and wanted to sort of, I guess, tie those two ideas together in this work. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that because I think it's nice to go back and think about what you were doing, maybe that's over 24 years ago. I'm going to play a little bit of this work. This work's called Woman of the Future. It was presented in an exhibition called The Wandering Eye that I curated and presented work with Brooke Andrew and Stephen Garrett. And I guess I want to acknowledge first that this work was filmed on Akaringa country and Tangaringa country, and it's called the Akaringa Ranges. And it's also termed the Painted Desert or the Badlands, and the landscape is just about 2 hours north of Cooper Pedy. I'm going to find a little spot. That might be. I think tension or a tensile condition that sits in my work really tips into violence here in this one. And a kind of, is that moving? I guess it focuses on a singular journey of a woman. I guess in relationship to the title of the exhibition overall, I see her as a wandering eye, EYEI, as she moves through the desert landscape. And between the camera, the female subject, and multiple others, the work kind of navigates an intricate and tensile choreography of partial and peripheral sensing. In the open, expansive space of the desert, the woman is encircled and enclosed, and we feel the internal pressure. In one moment, an arm cuts across the screen and tethers to her arm, as if physically projecting out from the camera and creating a kind of a new horizon. There's a power struggle that's being played out here. And while it centers on the female subject, there's clearly other peripheral male subjects that sit in relationship to her journey and her experience in time and space. It locates the work in a kind of Australian Gothic. It's filmed in the half hour just as sunrise and sunset. And I guess within this work, it has a slightly more filmic quality. There's more of a narrative arc that sits in it rather than a kind of an abstracted image of the body. And I think that filmic quality allows a kind of complex subjectivity to sort of take place in relationship to the work. Yeah, I think about relations of power, and I think that they're incredibly nuanced and difficult to pin down. And I think this work is perfectly played by a great friend of mine, Victoria Chu, and a collaborator. And I think what it attempts is a kind of complex portrait that she's simultaneously resilient in fear for her life, an apparition of her future and past self, and perhaps the crime scene that is herself. To me, the work kind of explores in many ways the kind of exquisite and delicate balance that can be held when directing in the round and in tune with the full dimensionality of female embodiment. And I think if I was to think about a director who also works filmically and thinks about the partial and peripheral gaze and works with embodiment within a filmic space, I'm thinking about Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and a film that's in a way speaks to painting more directly and the gaze of the portrait, but there is a peripheral sensing and a partiality to the gaze. And if we go back and think about when I was talking about the Vitruvian Man and the kind of sense of a symbolic whole, this work and this way of directing in the round allows me to break that or put holes in the whole and allow for openings and allow for different kinds of experiences that sit through the filmic gaze in relationship to the eye and conditions of embodiment. And I sort of claim that in many of my works as a female gaze, and a female gaze that affords a kind of complex dimensionality to pass through the screen. I'm just going to go to Ringer, which Yes, we are the University of Melbourne. Thanks for the captioning. I can make a joke, even though the work seems very serious. Maybe that's what comes out of me as an artist. This is a 3-screen filmic work. Each screen is curved and sits at the periphery of a 9-meter diameter circle. I see the screen architecture of this work as inherently sculptural and follows through on a circular logic that I could trace right back to Virginis at the beginning of this talk, but way, way back into the early works that I've been navigating through my practice. I keep coming back to the circle. I don't know why. But there's something about that condition of turning and the way that it enables a particular kind of movement to take place between bodies in space and in relationship to structure. It has a sound score by Françoise Tertaz that's quite filmic. Frank is a Grammy Award-winning sound designer, and there's a 9-speaker sound design. And Frank and I had many, many conversations when we were sort of thinking about this work and thinking about what that score would be. And he's such an interesting person. But what we were trying to do is to sort of sit the sound in the body, where the body sits, in the center of this circle and in the center of the space, rather than trying to trace the action or the movement of bodies on screen. So that the relationship to what's happening on screen happens here and it's shifting here, it's not shifting there. And this screen architecture in a way allowed a kind of holding space for an embodied experience with the work that I think is quite unique. It also allows for a kind of navigation of peripheral and partial viewing. It's not a complete circle, there are breaks. You can't see all the screens at the same time. So there's a sense that when you're held within the space, you are yourself turning to try to get a sense of what might be happening or what you might be sensing behind you or what's moving past you. All of the bodies in the work similarly are, they're shifting in a way that you can't capture them. And at the core of this work is an action film sequence that's played out between 6 World Championship roller derby players. I was thinking about the form of roller derby as a kind of arena, a contested arena. And they come together, I think, in a kind of consensual or potentially contractual relationship of violence and a kind of tensile combat that's enacted upon one another within the arena of this work. When I first entered it, I was thinking about what is that space of violence between female players, and I chose roller derby as a kind of first arena, and I chose a kind of idea of an action film sequence as a first point of departure. But I think those arenas sit in our familial environments, they sit in our institutional environments, they sit in corporate environments, in sporting arenas. And I think for me, when I was first trying to understand this work, I was thinking about what's at stake for female players and for women in the arenas that we inhabit. As the work progressed, what I realized is actually that tensile condition, that assertiveness or the rage that might come through a violence enacted by a woman upon a woman or a group of women in a consensual relationship together was just as sensual as it was violent. And that there's a sensuality, I think, that's held within this work that's really, really interesting. It's pleasure and it's pressure. And it's so aesthetic in its filmic quality that sort of sensuality, the slow movement of it, I think plays out in a really sort of interesting kind of way. And that surprised me about it. I think also it does something different to, say, a Tarantino or a Michael Mann that might place a female subject that might as well be a man as a point of fixture within an action film sequence. This work tries to disperse that and make it impossible to fix the female subjects or capture them or hold them. And again, it's that dispersion or opening out that moves away through the experience of a kind of oculocentric or patriarchal gaze into a gaze that I would claim as a female embodiment, that is fully dimensional, that is sensual, but it's also expressive and violent and difficult to pin down. There are some interesting abstractions in this work also, and I want to speak particularly just to this condition of blue, which I would describe as a cinematic blue, or a blue eye that sits at the center of this work. And it's just a shifting condition of light that holds its own durational moment within the work. And I think there's lots of durational moments that are cinematic in their operation that's within the work as well. I just want to say, I think that something that's also kind of important is what a durational moment does as a sort of slow cinematic experience. And I would bring it back again to sculpture, and I bring it back perhaps to Tarkovsky, if I was to locate the master, in thinking about what it is to sculpt in time, and that when you hold a moment durationally, you sort of asking the viewer to spend time with the moving image and to really sort of start to understand the very materiality of the filmic medium itself, but also to have the opportunity to transition through a range of different registers in relation to what's been experienced. So what might be felt as sensual in one moment might shift to something that becomes entropic, to something that feels violent again. And it's that shifting condition that I'm kind of really interested in exploring, and alighting again, I think in relationship to the screen architecture and the kind of space within which those experiences are held. Maybe that's enough, David? I think, yeah, I mean, I could keep going about this work because I'm quite passionate about it. But we're 13:04, which means 1:04, which might open up opportunities for questions. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Cate, for just, taking us through the really beautiful complexities of your practice and especially leaving us with, the monumental ringer that's now on show. We've got some time for questions, and I'm wondering if people have questions that they'd like to ask Cate about her practice. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, when I first kind of was starting to think about this work, I had these blue gels. I got all these pictures of roller derby players, and then I hung all these blue gels over them. I think I was interested in kind of neo-noir filmic moments. And I've since tracked the different blues through all the Michael Mann films. I was thinking about Krzysztof Kieslowski's blue. This is a particular blue because, again, it feels like twilight, and that's where it kind of maybe connects to the kind of purple haze that sits within A Woman of the Future. It's a shifting kind of condition. It's not quite bright blue. It's not dark. There's a transitional kind of moment. It's melancholy. I think color speaks to so many different things. I don't know, it just felt right, I think it just felt right for this work. And the work was filmed in blue. So it was filmed using a circular track, and we had a range of blue lights creating their own circular structure that was alighting the roller derby players. And so that was a decision that I made. And this is a cinematic blue in the sense that it is actually filmed through a cinematic camera and through smoke. And it's not a blue screen, it's actually doing something else. It's a vibrating, pulsing surface, an active surface, which is probably why I put Stalker Prow in there, because I felt similarly that work right back in 1999 was trying to do something similar. Yeah. Yep. Questions?
Anyone else? Yeah, please.
I mean, I haven't always been able to do that, but I think Buxton gave me that opportunity. And I think that's what I went to the museum with. It's like, I want this screen architecture and I'll hustle for everything else. I always, because it was filmed in the round using a circular track, the logic of I guess the screen architecture extended off that. And it's just like following a circular logic all the way through. And I always had a feeling if I wanted the viewer to enter the center of the work, which is different to looking at a screen. That's more perspectival. This is sculptural, it's immersive, it's embodied. And, you know, I didn't really know how it was going to play out, Peter, but because of the big risk. But my instinct for spatial practice and the way that sculpture and structures might sit in a space is really strong because I come through that language. And I just drew the plans up and I don't think we budged from it. Like that's what happened. And then you just kind of discover it. Just like, okay, this is what it, but I wanted that, it's an arena. So it has to feel, it needed the scale, I think. And it can hold a lot of people in there, which is kind of amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. Well, it's been there for a long time, actually. Like I started working with moving image in the early 2000s and I was making these little fluttering eyelash works. And I was placing these kind of screen objects. I'd see them as sculptures, but screen objects in relationship to sculptural elements in the gallery. And I guess they're exhibitions that I haven't shown here, but you know, that kind of play between form, sculptural form and moving image was sort of there very early on. And also that play between stillness and movement or a continuous image that felt closer to sculpture. I've just danced between both and it seems strange that my figuration, again, it's so expressive and mannered and I kind of like look at it and go, why do I make things that look like that? But it's just how it happens. I don't know how to answer that question. I feel like I just keep moving actually between them. And maybe I'll go back to a kind of a different language of sculpture moving on from this work. Again, I don't know. I mean, it just depends on what feels good. Yeah.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I mean, I can speak to that in terms of bringer, and that's why I was trying to describe a kind of an intention and then what the work did. And I'm trying to, I guess I'm speaking to a kind of softening that happened. And it took me about 6 weeks to actually try to understand what it was doing because there was no way to see it beforehand. I think it takes time. Like I'm still reflecting upon works from 10, 20 years ago. And sometimes it's too soon to really understand what happened or what it is. But what I would say is the work does speak back to you and hitting light again with screen like this, you're really sculpting with light and it takes a long time to sort of feel that. So I always just sort of try to feel it through my body. I go with my instinct, but then I'm often shocked by what happens. And I think that's a good thing because otherwise we would be too much in control. And I like to perhaps be a little bit out of control while still being quite precise. Does that make sense? I like to take risks in the work. And this was a kind of big risk. Actually, there's quite a lot at stake in this work. So it didn't kind of work. There's so much space around it. It would be like, oh shit, didn't really hold that one together, you know. So yeah, I think it takes time. Yeah, that's it.
We might leave it there, but Cate, thank you. Well, firstly, congratulations on Ringer and the whole career. And on behalf of everybody, just thank you for just sharing so generously with us today. It really means a lot. Thank you.
Thanks.